Welcome to episode 20 of the Ikario podcast. Today's episode is basically a mini-sode. It's a bit shorter than usual. And it is something that we recorded that we wanted to add about the following topic. It is about the apparent conflict between systemic things and personal responsibility. So what I mean is, are the results that you get, is the circumstances of your life, are they defined by like the system you live in, by the government, by kind of your environment, forces outside yourself? And is therefore the solution to your problems is that these things need to change, So maybe the government needs to do something to improve your life circumstances. That would be the systemic side. On the other side is like personal responsibility. It's all up to you. It's all about you. And interestingly, this is something that is also politicized. So there's kind of a left and right divide here. And this is one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this, because the way, I guess, at ikario, we have an approach to this, a way of thinking about this that's a bit different from this usual kind of politicized view of this topic. And the reason I wanted to share this is because I think that there is, let's say, a compromise or a middle way between these things that is actually more useful for you as a person, right? You as a person, you want to live a better life. And so which of these beliefs is right? Well, that's not really the right question. Rather, it's about where does environment and forces outside yourself matter? What influence do they have? And where does individual responsibility matter? And how do you use the insight about both of these things to live the best life you can possibly live? You can think of this episode as like an addendum to some of the things we've talked about when we've talked about the human zoo and escaping the human zoo, and the whole idea of the blog post we have, Whole Food Island, the idea of how strongly your environment affects your outcomes. However, even if you are not familiar with those things, this works as a standalone episode. I think you'll find this interesting, and most importantly, you'll find this useful for applying in your own life. You can find the show notes for this episode, as well as links to anything else you might want to find around Ikario and the Ikario podcast, by going to ikario.com/020 for episode 20. And with that, let's get into this episode.
Welcome to the Ikario podcast, where we help you optimize your life, break free from the human zoo, and become a force to be reckoned with. Once again, with your hosts, Ollie and the man himself.
And I'm Shane. And today we're doing a mini-sode. We're going to talk about personal responsibility versus systemic problems and systemic causes, which doesn't sound very fascinating, right? Okay, don't turn off yet. Here's the thing. So this is pretty important when it comes to the bigger picture topic that we talk about, is like how to live a better life. And if you want to live a better life, then you need to know what are the causes of your suffering or your discomfort or your low life quality. And it's good to know the causes, because then you can know the solutions. Or at least that would seem logical. Mm-hmm. And if you think about the two things I just mentioned, personal responsibility on the one side and systemic causes on the other side, you can also think about this as, this is typically kind of maps onto the political spectrum of left and right. So let's briefly talk about that, because then maybe it makes a bit more sense, right? You generally have on the right, on the political right, you generally have the attitude that it's all about individual responsibility. Which is to say that if you want to live a good life, then you have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you have to work hard, you have to get a good education, you have to be smart and tough and so on. It's like you have to take care of yourself. And in general, again, on the political right, the idea is we want to create a world where people who work hard and do the right thing get rewarded, so that the result of your hard work and so on will be that you have a better life and you're successful and so on. And where people who do the wrong things get punished. So it's down to individuals, right? And if the world you find yourself in is somehow bad, it's because of bad people. And those bad people ought to be good instead, right? And if they're not good, we're going to punish them. That's essentially the idea, right? We're going to reward people who do well. We're going to punish people who don't do well. We're going to lock all the bad people away, and then we have the perfect world, essentially. So that's the idea, obviously pretty simplified, but that's the idea of it's about personal responsibility. On the political left, there's usually much more emphasis on systemic causes. So you're saying, look, there's poor people on the street, homeless people. You can't just tell them to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. They need some kind of help, support. Like, we need to build a system that supports these people, that gives people, health care and social care and so on and so forth. Essentially, it's much more of we have to create a system that uplifts everyone, and is much less emphasis on personal responsibility. And this is one of the big conflicts of why these sides usually can't stand each other, right? Because they fundamentally disagree about what needs to happen. Because it's almost like, from the personal responsibility perspective, it's like what you want to. So someone's a lazy, do no good, and that's because that's so they're homeless, right? It must be their fault somehow. And now you want to give them free money and stuff. You want to reward people for being lazy, do nothings, right? That seems terrible from that perspective. And then from the left perspective, it's like, what, you want to just have people starve in the street? That seems terrible.
Yeah.
Okay, and so that would be how this maps onto the political left and right. And another example you can use to think of this is the obesity epidemic. Right? We have a massive rise in obesity rates. It's something ridiculous. Like I think it's past 50% in the US now.
Mate, it's more than that.
It's more than
so
that.
Last time I checked, 72% of all adults in the US are either overweight or obese.
Right.
That's almost 3/4 of all adults.
That is insane. Yeah. So you have a hugely rising trend of overweight people. And of course, then lots and lots of health consequences, healthcare costs, and so on and so forth. And again, you can say, okay, it's your fault that you're fat. It's your fault that you're fat, and you kept eating, and you eventually got a heart attack or something. It's your fault. You should have not done that. That's the personal responsibility perspective. The systemic cause perspective is, hold on, we have a system, we have food deserts, right, where people live in places where you basically can't get healthy food. It's almost inaccessible, but you can get all kinds of fast food, junk food, etc., etc. The junkiest, worst food for you is the cheapest food, and the good food is the most expensive. You have kids being fed junk food as their school lunch and so on. It's like by the time they get a chance to take personal responsibility, it's already too late. And again, there seems to be a conflict here, because it's like, okay, well, which is it? Is the system the problem, or is it about personal responsibility?
Yeah.
And I think this is important to resolve because this black and white perspective, in fact, the perspective of it's either one or the other, is just not useful. It's useful if you just want to be squabbling about it forever. But if you actually want to solve these problems, you have to actually make something happen, then it's not useful to be on one or the other side of this idea.
Yeah.
And so basically the way I think of this, or the way I apply this in my own thinking and in my own life, is that you have systemic causes and personal solutions. And you also have systemic solutions, but if you have something like, again, if we take the obesity epidemic, it is clearly a matter of environment. If you put people in a certain environment, then the majority of them will be overweight or obese. And I think the clearest indicator of this is that there are studies that track people who migrate, so people who move, let's say, from Japan to the US. And although Japan is catching up with obesity and so on, like for a long time, Japan had, a very low, let's say, national BMI compared to the US. And so you can say, oh, well, it's a cultural thing. Culturally, they eat different foods and so on and so forth. That's why they're not all overweight. But if you track people who move from Japan to the States, they become overweight, right? So pretty reliably, if you take people out of the food environment that they were in Japan and put them in the food environment of the United States, they gain weight. So clearly it's a systemic cause, right? They don't switch their culture like that. And there's many other indicators like that. So basically, as fast food chains and things like that reach new areas, people's weight goes up. So you can clearly see the systemic causes where just, again, the environment around people changes in such a way that bad foods are more accessible, healthy foods are less accessible, more unhealthy foods are pushed on people through advertising and so on and so forth. And as a result, people get overweight. And the key here is that this is a reliable, population-wide effect. It's predictable. You can predict, if we take these people and put them in here, we know that 5 years later, 70% of them are going to be overweight or obese. We can predict that. And that's a systemic problem. Now, of course, you can argue for systemic solutions. You could say, well, we need to do something about this. We need to change the environment in such a way that people are healthier, without making an extra effort. And that would be ideal. But there's a huge problem when it comes to personal development, when it comes to your own life quality. There's one big problem with this way of thinking, which is that this isn't going to happen anytime soon. Even if we take some issue like this and we say, okay, we're going to get active, we're going to make sure that, politically something happens here, we're going to try to make a cultural shift happen. Like, even if you're extraordinarily successful at doing this, it's still going to take decades. It's going to take decades for this change to really start to have an effect. And so it is very noble, I think, to have that as like your life's mission, to try to make that happen. But the way I see it is like political change is mostly for the generations that follow you. You try to make political change so that people who come after you have a better life. But for your own life, right now, it's up to personal responsibility. It's up to you to make sure that you are not one of those 72% of people who have this problem.
It's like it's not your fault, but it's your responsibility. Exactly.
It's almost a strange thing to say, isn't it? It's not your fault, but it's your responsibility.
Yeah.
And this is one of those kind of slightly uncomfortable and unintuitive spots that if you can learn to sit in that spot, there's a lot of power in that. Because it takes away, so I would say that the downside of the systemic side, if you think of it in terms of systemic, the downside of that is it puts you in a victim role.
Mm.
It puts you in a role that's like, oh, this is happening to me, oh no. And that's not great for making personal change, for personal growth, right? And the downside of the personal responsibility side is that it can make you feel like a failure more than is warranted. It can make you put too much pressure on yourself, and it can make you try to use willpower to solve problems. And using willpower to solve problems is generally a recipe for failure.
Yeah, and I think in addition to that, it can also make you unempathic towards people. Like you see people who are homeless, and if you have that mindset, it's like, well, if they just thought a certain way, if they tapped into their beliefs, if they took responsibility and all this other stuff, then they would be like me.
Yeah.
But instead it's like, no. Whereas in that mindset, you're kind of ignoring the systemic things, or even the things that came before it. Like, this person's homeless, and if you tracked all the things that they went through, all the environments they were in growing up and what they were subjected to and stuff, they produced this result pretty predictably.
Yeah.
But if you're too far towards the individual, then you won't see that. You'll just see this guy needs to sort his shit out.
Yeah. And you won't have empathy for others, and also you won't have empathy for yourself. Because I think this applies to each individual person as well. It's like whatever the things are that you're struggling with, whatever the things are that whatever it is that you perceive as weaknesses and flaws and so on in yourself, I think it's pretty accurate. In most cases, it's pretty accurate to say that it's basically not your fault. Like, you didn't choose to have these flaws. And like you say, if we could observe the entire history of a person, if we could see every moment in time that they've experienced, everything that they've experienced, all the things they've gone through, the way they grew up, people they met, how they were treated by their parents, by their friends, etc., etc. Right? If we could see all that, then their current behavior would make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And that's a very different perspective from just saying, well, you know, fuck you, you're lazy.
Yeah, it's like what Brené Brown says. It's like the second time I think we've talked about her. Future podcast guest.
Hopefully, yeah.
Is she mentioned that everyone's just doing their best.
Yeah.
And she got some resistance from a lot of people for saying that publicly. It's like, what do you mean? This person clearly isn't doing the best. And she kind of took that line with it. It's like, well, if you knew all the factors that led this person to where they are right now, and if you could see all of that, not a single moment excluded, you'd be like, well, that makes complete sense why they're like that.
Totally. And look, I've also personally been in that situation where where people look at me and go, you're not even trying. And I am trying my hardest, right? It's like I'm breaking myself trying so damn hard. But from the outside, it seems like I'm not even making an effort. I've been in that position, like in several areas of life throughout my life. I know what that feels like. You know, I know what that feels like to be the person that where others can look at you and kind of justifiably say, well, Jesus, make an effort, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And just another thing as well is when I think of, you know, just a person who might be on the right overly individualist end of the spectrum, I almost always imagine someone in a suit, you know, someone who's working for a law firm or something. I don't even know what to refer to. That's how not part of that world I am.
Yeah.
But actually, people who take that radically individualist mindset come in all types. You know, they're all types of people. Like, for example, I used to be a bit of a hippie and I used to knock around with people who are like sort of spiritually minded. People who are just like, your thoughts control your reality, and you know, you got to just control the quality of your thoughts, positive thinking all the time, and that determines everything in your life. And I've met a few people before who took that to its extreme, where they said that if you developed cancer or something to that effect, that must mean that your thoughts were negative and you didn't think positively enough. And I was like, Jesus Christ, you're really going to go that far with this, are you?
Yeah.
And it just made me think then, because I was like, no, those people who are radically individualist on the right end of the spectrum were not dressed in suits. They were dressed in harem pants, going to yoga class. And they were like, you know, if you're not thinking positively enough, then that's your fault. Whatever happens in your life is your fault. And it's like, wow. It
can be used as like a victim blaming thing. And again, I would encourage you to think of that, like to turn that inwards and be like, you can be the victim that you're blaming, you know, because victim blaming can be for external victims, but it can also, it's something you could do to yourself, right? You're just beating yourself up over all your perceived flaws and so on because you don't have that empathy.
Right. So just so I clarify it, just so I know what you mean, it's like in the same sense that a person might say, look at a homeless person and be like, you need to just sort your shit out. You need to think more, you know, or think more positively, or be more diligent, or work harder, etc. That's likely the same judgments that you would throw towards yourself when things aren't going so well.
Yeah,
maybe
because basically you're saying you deserve the bad things that are happening to you because you didn't work hard enough or you didn't do the right things. You know,
right?
And so that's what you feel about yourself too. It's like, I deserve to be miserable or to have been rejected or to be whatever because I clearly didn't do enough. You know. So it just perpetuates that. It's another way to perpetuate the whole I am not enough thing which is kind of a core belief in our culture, I think, right? We all feel like we're never enough. And so that's the concept, right? And that's the idea. This is an example of what I call the balancing act, where there are two things that seem to be opposites, or there are two positions where it seems like it's either one or the other. And generally people disagree about it and squabble about it on the internet, right? And it's the balancing act. So maybe I need to find a better word for this, because the balancing act is not really a middle position where you say, well, they both have some points, you know? It's not also, you know, there's often a mockery about like enlightened centrism, you know, enlightened centrism where you're also, well, this side is bad and that side is also bad. You know, where you just refuse to take you refuse to have an opinion almost, right?
Is it a bit of a cop out?
It is. It could be a total cop out. But what I think of as the balancing act is actually, it's not just I'm going to just be in the middle and be like, yeah, sure, and maybe also this, whatever. It's more like how an electron is a wave and a particle at the same time.
Yeah.
And there's no way, that makes no sense, right? The human brain can't make sense of that.
It's both things.
It's both things, and this is why, I don't know if we've talked about this, but this is why Schrodinger's cat, the thought experiment of Schrodinger's cat. So if anyone doesn't know this, right, it's a thought experiment where you put a cat in a box, and the box is completely sealed. You can't look inside, you can't hear anything, whatever, right? It's completely sealed. And inside the box, there's like a little thing that fires an electron at a receiver. And the receiver simply does one of two things. If the receiver receives a wave, then it will release some poison that would kill the cat. If the receiver is hit by a particle, it will do nothing. Okay? So you shoot an electron at this receiver, and then the question is the cat dead or alive? And the answer is both. Okay? This cat is dead and alive at the same time. So, and this is a really weird thought experiment. But I think it's fairly well known, right? It's gotten a lot of kind of press. But I think the reason the reason for this thought experiment is because you tell people an electron is a wave and a particle at the same time, they don't freak out. And from that you're like, okay, you don't understand what I'm saying.
An electron's not cute.
Yeah. But you say, no, this cat is dead and alive at the same time. It's not one or the other. It's both at the same time. And then you're like, well, that's impossible. Okay, now you start understanding how weird an electron is, right? So, and this is what I think of the balancing act. It's like, it's more being in this weird kind of almost unstable position where you just realize, yes, this is true and this is also true, and these things that seem to contradict each other, they're also like both true at the same time. And your brain doesn't really fully want to accept this. Your brain kind of wants to say, well, but which is it though, right? But there is this, and I've noticed this, and I'm sure we'll do an episode on this at some point. I've noticed many, many examples of this, where if you truly consider like the two conflicting poles, and you become this vibrating thing in the middle that's like unpleasant, but it's like, oh shit, now it's like for a brief moment, it can start making sense before your brain flips back into a comfortable either or position, you know? Mm-hmm. So that's what I mean by a balancing act. It's like, yes, there's a lot to understand about systemic causes, and there's a lot to understand about personal responsibility. And there is this weird middle position where if you can occupy that position, that gives you, I think, the best chance to actually make changes in your own life, positive changes in your own life, and possibly also affect larger positive changes around you. And to make this a little bit simpler, or to make this a little bit more practical, right? How do you practically apply this? Well, one thing you can do is you can look at any area of your life you want to improve, and you can consider these two perspectives. On the one hand, this is not my fault. On the one hand, especially for like irrational compulsive behavior that you have around something, you didn't choose this. And again, if you look at the environment you're in, if you look at your history, if you look at all kinds of things that have happened to you in your life that you didn't have a choice about, lots of that stuff explains this irrational behavior or this flaw that you have right now. So this is not your fault. This is an outcome of the environment that you have found yourself in. And at the same time, you can take responsibility for this, and you can choose to change your habits. You can choose to do whatever steps might be involved in changing this outcome for yourself. Those are both true. And even further, we can kind of fold this over, but we can fold this over on itself once more by saying one of the ways in which you can take personal responsibility and change your outcomes is by changing your environment. Okay, because you can say so, and we've used the example of obesity and stuff several times, so let's stick with that. I have this too. Like, I'm a compulsive eater. I have basically no self-control around food, and I tend to overeat and so on. And one of the ways in which I manage this is that I make sure that there's no junk food in the house. And there are several categories of food. I just can't have any of that in the house. If there's any of this in this apartment, I'm going to eat all of it within minutes.
If there's any of it, pretty soon there'll be none of it.
Exactly. And so I have to. So, and again, like, this is one of the things I don't actually know what the root cause of my compulsive eating is. Don't know. That's one of the things I haven't dug into yet. But I realized, look, this is not my fault. I don't know why I do this. It's not my fault. I don't blame myself for it. I don't feel bad about it, basically. I'm like, okay, this is one of the things I have to deal with. And one of the ways but I take responsibility. I'm not just, oh my God, poor me. I take responsibility and I control this thing, and I make sure that the outcome I would naturally drift towards would be overweight for sure, easily, gladly, basically, right? But that's not the outcome I want, and I take responsibility for having a different outcome, and I do that by controlling my environment.
Got you. So that's where so that's the practical element. Mm-hmm. So if you went, say, for example, the radically individualist route, you wouldn't change your environment. The junk food would still be there, but you'd be telling yourself, probably shaming yourself, saying, for God's sake, I should be able to resist this.
Yeah. I told myself I'd have only one cookie.
Covered in cookies. Just like, I should have been able to resist.
Yeah.
I'm such a piece of shit.
Yeah.
But you're saying that you are sort of taking the individualist approach to, taking responsibility for your situation by saying, I'm going to change the environment that gives rise to this effect. Yeah,
so I'm taking, because there's something empowering about the individual responsibility perspective. It says you can change your circumstance.
Yeah, I totally see the appeal.
And so then, and I agree with that. Yes, I can do this. It's up to me. But I also tap into the empathy of the other side and say, well, it's not my fault that I got here, or that I'm not making myself feel bad about the flaw in the first place.
That's cool. That's like using the Schrodinger's cat element. Like, it's both things. I'm responsible for this, but the environment is also giving rise to these cravings and cues.
Yeah.
So now that I know that, I can change it.
All right. So that's something I wanted to talk about, because I think it's an important concept that also goes into our whole thing about, Whole Food Island, which we'll link to, again, for anyone who hasn't seen that yet. And with Ikario, this is one of the core ideas for Ikario is to upgrade your life, and doing it in large part by changing your environment. That's always the first thing that I look for, is how can I change my environment to build the habits that I want, to get the outcomes I want, and so on.
That is I've got to say, just for a second, that's what I've noticed to be the most reliable way of changing my behaviors. I mean, before meeting you, I'd never really encountered that concept seriously, because I was very much thinking about it in terms of individual responsibility and stuff. But it was quite interesting. At Christmas, I went back home to the UK for a few weeks, and as soon as I walk in to my father's house, there is it's like, where a fruit bowl would usually be.
Let me guess, it's full of cookies or something.
There's a fruit bowl full of celebrations.
Yeah,
and reliably, I walk in, I'm like, hey, how's it going? Ooh.
Yeah, exactly.
I've had 3.
Yeah.
I literally in 2020, I didn't have a celebration, a single one, but within that moment I had 3, and I stayed there for a few weeks, and I ate so much chocolate, and there was always like cider in the fridge. I'd have a couple of ciders every now and then. It'd just be like, and it's not as if I could have resisted it, but the environmental cues were just very strong. So yeah, obviously by changing my environment and coming back here, it's like, oh, I'm not eating any chocolate. I've not drank since I got here. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's also a huge thing about. So part of it is your physical environment, and obviously something like, is there a bowl full of candy or not is a very clear example. But there's also a lot of other more subtle stuff that's going on. And also your social environment is a huge driver of this kind of thing. And this is one of the reasons why, it's like you guys, so currently 4 people on the ikario team are living together in an apartment. And that's something that makes a huge difference. You get 4 people together who are all like growth-minded, interested in personal development, have like the same, kind of shared goals and things. It makes a huge difference, like your social environment, right?
Without a doubt, you absorb it like a sponge. You walk back and you got Ryan meditating, you got Dean stood there doing some kung fu poses, and you got Jonas writing a script. And it's just like, well, okay, well, these people are all working on something, and I'm not going to be the one that's just sat there eating celebrations. You're just not going to do that. So yeah.
So, and that's I wanted to make this episode, by the way, just for a bit of context. I wanted to make this episode because we talked about this on a podcast episode about the human zoo, but we didn't like how that episode turned out. We did a re-recording, and in the re-recording, we kind of neglected this topic a bit.
Yeah.
Because I think it's an important topic, and it's also something I'm sure we're going to call back to this again and again, so we have this episode to refer to. And also when it comes to like environment change and things like that, like the practical applications of how to change your environment to change your habits and change your life quality and outcomes, we are going to be publishing content on that quite a lot this year. So if you are not subscribed yet, the ikario channel, the main ikario channel on YouTube, you can subscribe there to get notified of those upcoming videos. And of course, as always, you can go to ikario.com to find all our other stuff and subscribe to all the other things.
That's it. That's the lot. We won't drag this on like our other famous outros, but that's it. Thank you for tuning in, guys, and see you again next week.